Professional success has enabled Bruce Bastian to fulfill a lifelong dream of providing philanthropic support to benefit, encourage, and preserve the rights of individuals. Long before he had any organized foundation for giving, he gave anonymously to the Utah AIDS Foundation and has continually supported their efforts for over 20 years. In 1996, Bruce formed the B.W. Bastian Foundation and has adopted a policy of supporting organizations that wholeheartedly embrace the principle of equality.
Individual philanthropic support for the Utah AIDS Foundation and other LGBT organizations is very important in Utah and other red states because you're not going to get a lot of support from the legislature. They are just not going to say, oh yeah, Utah AIDS, well, let's give them a couple of million. That's just not the Utah legislature. So individuals really have to step up, and that's what makes the difference. There was one night on television that had an interview with someone from the Utah AIDS Foundation, how they were really in dire needs and the Utah legislature was going to cut funding. It had no valid reasoning why they would cut the funding from these people. AIDS was very much misunderstood then. I think in some ways it still is. There are people saying that, well, you know, if you get AIDS, it's probably because you deserve it. That's silly. The rationale is just crazy. So I gave a fairly significant anonymous donation. And it made all the news, which wasn't the purpose, but it did save the Utah AIDS Foundation. This was over 20 years ago. And that was my first contribution to any LGBT organization or fund or issue. And I've given to the Utah AIDS Foundation ever since. The Utah AIDS Foundation, in my opinion, is one of the star AIDS foundations in the country. They have a terrific staff, both paid and mostly volunteer. They are so selfless, so hardworking, so engaged, and really thinking about new ways of doing things all the time. They really change the lives of people with HIV. They really save the lives of many people. They really are a bright spot in the community. I don't think any one person can do any of this alone. It's one thing to give somebody money, but when they really take the money and really make change, they're the ones that deserve all the praise to me. I always feel kind of uncomfortable when I get an award because it's never been the goal. I don't do what I do so people will stand up and say, yay, yay, Bruce. But I am honored, and I hope the fact that they are honoring me will influence others to do more.
While serving as a health advisor to the U.S. Senate, Dr. David Sundwall took an academic rather than a political stance on issues. At the onset of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, he took ignorance, fear, prejudice, and political bias surrounding the crisis head-on. Without any personal judgment for those afflicted with this deadly disease, he spearheaded effective legislation to educate caregivers, the general population, and those most at risk, establish funding for healthcare to those who couldn't afford it, and stimulate research that would prove to have benefits far beyond this virus.
I was the health staff director for Senator Orrin Hatch when he chaired the Labor and Human Resources Committee in the U.S. Senate. We had many responsibilities, including funding for NIH and the FDA, CDC, all of these agencies in the Public Health Service. We also had to respond to problems as they developed in America that needed a public health response. And I'll never forget the day I received a phone call from someone I didn't know named Bruce Decker. He said, well, I'm an openly gay man and I work for the Republican governor of California, and we have a serious public health problem you need to be aware of. So that was the beginning of my involvement with HIV/AIDS, and from there we went on to convene hearings in the Senate and develop legislation to respond. It was a great challenge. We had a lot of stigma against homosexuals and drug users who are most at risk of this, but this fatal virus was no respecter of persons. It could attack anyone if it got entree to the body. So for our very first hearing, we were fortunate to find a man from Texas who was heterosexual, father of 5. He had contracted the HIV through being hemophiliac. He explained that his children couldn't go to school in their Dallas neighborhood because of the fear people had they might contract the disease. It was a strange climate, and it took a lot of us working together to make sure people were not afraid for unfounded reasons of this virus. Very quickly, we developed funding for what we called educational training centers, and that funding started what became a series of bills to address research and health education and really some care for people with HIV who otherwise couldn't afford it. There was a great deal of money that flowed into HIV/AIDS research, and when people would counter saying, why are you doing this for one disease and especially for those kind of people, I would say, no, it's for all of us, because this research will fund scientific advancements in cancer, infectious disease, immunology, all of them related to HIV, but none of them unique to that particular virus. After the work in the Senate, I volunteered at a clinic in Washington where I saw many, many patients with HIV/AIDS, all of whom died before 1996. So it was really sad in that respect, but gratifying that when the new antiviral medications came in and were developed through all that research I talked about, they were able to sustain a reasonably normal life. And to this day, I have some acquaintances with HIV/AIDS who are functioning, tax-paying citizens and living with a chronic illness, to be sure. But I'm pleased that I've been able to see firsthand and then see the benefits of the research that we stimulated that's made this not so likely to be initially fatal, but more a chronic disease we can manage. I've been involved in different ways over the years, but I kind of assumed that this was all in my past, and to receive the recognition means a lot to me, and I hope I've contributed in some way, having been in the right place at the right time to receive information and then act on it pretty quickly. So I'm very pleased that they've recognized me this way. Thank you.
In 1996, Sarah McClellan gave up retirement in order to serve a community she loves. She embraced a segment of the population that was underserved, yet in great need, residents of northern Utah who had contracted HIV. At the time, many who were suffering with this fatal disease had no access to education or support. In 1997, Sarah founded the Northern Utah Coalition in Ogden. After 16 years, Sarah continues to work tirelessly because she knows she is making a positive difference in her community.
I began working with HIV in 1996. My friend, Reverend Shirley Jones, called me one day and said, "I need assistance in helping me to look at some funding for HIV, because up in northern Utah, we don't have an organization that is really doing anything specific for people of color that has been hard hit with this disease." And in 1996, there was a lot of emphasis on education. At that time, there was a lot of myth and stigma and misunderstanding about HIV and AIDS. Even though it had been around since 1980, it was still quite scary. When you look at the statistics, especially for people of color, and African American women between the age of 24 and 34, it is one of the leading causes of death, and people don't realize that. Our focus and our role has really changed. In the very beginning, like I said, we talked about mostly education, and so we were not working one-on-one with clients like we do today. We do testing for HIV, we do community outreach. We have 25 drop centers that we provide materials for high-risk behaviors. We also do health relationship training, because it's not just the person that is infected with the HIV or AIDS that is infected, but it impacts the whole family. So in order to be effective, you have to know that you have to treat the whole family. It is very important that folks have somewhere to go, because it is still here after 30 years. We still have folks that are getting infected and they still need services. I have had so many positive experiences. I'm very passionate about this, and I believe in what I do, and I know that every day, just about, I make a difference in someone's life. I think that's my story, is just making a difference and letting folks know that they matter and that I care. I am just honored that the Utah AIDS Foundation and the Board of Trustees thought enough to think about a person like me and to honor. I'm truly thankful and very grateful.
While working as an epidemiologist at the Salt Lake County Health Department, Sue Yannick found her professional calling. Noticing other staff members were reluctant to pick up HIV case files, Sue requested assignment to the HIV studies and began serving as a one-on-one counselor for those who had tested positive. This led her to be in contact with almost every Salt Lake County AIDS case. She approached each patient with respect and extreme compassion.
I'm very fond of cats, and there is a disease called feline leukemia. It's a retrovirus. It attacks the immune system, and I knew about that disease. And when I first heard some of the headlines about AIDS, I thought, this sounds like feline leukemia. And I knew there was no cure for feline leukemia and that it was very deadly, and so I took a real interest in it. My job at Salt Lake County Health Department was to counsel people after their HIV tests. Specifically, the ones that I counseled were the ones whose tests were HIV positive. And the second part of my job was to interview them for partners, because they're infected, someone else has infected them, and potentially infected someone else. And that's a pretty tense interview. You're asking them about the most private part of their life, and yet it's very important that we get those people in and get them tested. Going and getting the partners was a big chunk of work, because the person coming in voluntarily for a test at the health department was somewhat prepared. When I would go out and contact a partner, they were just getting a bucket of cold water in the face. It's a crisis. People are finding out now it's a life-threatening disease, but there is hope. But years back, it was almost a death sentence. And I think that calls for some real counseling and some support to be there for them. It was very tough in the beginning. We were giving these clients very little. We were giving them some bad news, kind of a pat on the shoulder, think positive, there may be a cure coming out or at least a treatment. We weren't giving them anything. I got thinking about my role in it, and I thought, there's just got to be something better. And I made it a point with all of my interviews with them to, number one, touch them, and number two, they had to laugh before they left my office. And I found it really rewarding to work with these clients. They're brave, wonderful people. I think it's really humbling. Not that I didn't do what I did, but it's just such an honor, because there are so many people who have done so much with this infection, and it's come such a long way. I'm surprised they remembered me. I've been retired for 5 years and thought that I was just a thing of the past, and so this was really a boost for me to realize that I was remembered and I was chosen.